A lot of people have been asking me, is the American blockade of the Strait of Hormuz really working? Is the blockade really blockading? Like the Gen Zs, used to say on the streets. This video is about answering that question. I'm sure by now you all know that there's a blockade. There's a blockade of a blockade. Iran is blockading the Strait of Hormuz, while America is blocking beyond the Strait of Hormuz, essentially pressure upon pressure. To answer the question, as to is the American blockade really blockading, we need to go back to at least the most recent of such blockades, which is the American blockade of Venezuela. In fact, President Trump actually promised that the Iranian blockade, the American blockade of Iran, would actually be exactly like the American blockade of Venezuela. However, so far, the American blockade of Iran has been absolutely nothing like the American blockade of Venezuela. I will give you proof. One is that while America was blockading Venezuela actively, America was actually firing at Venezuelan boats that emerged from the shores of Venezuela, usually on their way to the nearest country, Colombia. The US of A insisted that those who were, on those boats, who were moving via those boats, were actually drug traffickers. So, what the US of A essentially did at that time was that it shot those boats out of the water. Massive casualties. Almost always, every single human on those boats were unalived. That was one major characteristic of the American blockade of Venezuela. When America insisted that the guys that were, riding on those boats, usually motorized, were drug traffickers, and as such, they could do and undo. They could essentially take them out, unalive them at no exact, cost to the concept of international law or international humanitarian law. The Venezuelan authorities back then, under the leadership of President Maduro, now ex-President Maduro, insisted that they were ordinary fishermen. Let us assume, that we don't exactly know the veracity of either. But whoever they were, America was shooting boats out of the water and was unaliving humans. It happened several times, and nobody questioned America. Nobody was taken to court. Nobody was jailed. Nobody was taken to the international, humanitarian courts, the ICJ or the World Court or anything like that in The Hague. That was one important characteristic of the American blockade of Venezuela. The second important characteristic was that as for oil ships that carried large volumes of oil, the VLCCs, the 2 million barrel, tankers and all that, America was boarding those ships. You know what it means to board a ship? You send armed sailors, armed, naval, men to actually as either land on the ships via helicopter or take charge of the ships. After taking charge of the ships, America seized the sailors and transported them to America. They were essentially, taken out of the ships, and America took custody of them. Number two, the crude oil that those ships carried were actually transported to the US of A and de facto became American property, seized on the high seas and became essentially American, irrespective of the country of origin. Some of these ships had links to Iran. Some of these ships had links to China. In fact, one particular celebrated case had a direct link to Russia. In fact, at some point, the crew on the ship took a Russian flag and hoisted it on the ship, essentially indicating that the ship has become a Russian ship. Despite that, America took charge of the ship, seized the sailors, and seized the oil. Again, that happened several times. And that happened to countries, not just middle power countries like Iran, but also, top superpowers, nuclear superpowers like China and Russia. So those were the two important characteristics of the American blockade of the Venezuelan, seas. Sailors were, whatever you call them, drug traffickers on the American side or fishermen on the Venezuelan side. They were shot out of the water and unalived. And number two, ships were taken, seized. The oil on the ships were seized, and the sailors on the ships were seized. I think the Russians got some of the sailors back at some point. Now, that was the seizure. That was the American blockade of Venezuela. Now, let us compare that to the current reality of the American blockade of Iran. Number one, as we speak, America has not fired any single bullet at anything that emerged from or is approaching the Strait of Hormuz. I don't know what CENTCOM is doing on the waters. They claim they have 12 ships there. They claim they have at least one aircraft carrier or more there. They claim they have over 10,000 sailors there. Understandably, we have a rough idea of how many sailors should be on an aircraft carrier, how many sailors should be on the destroyer or the frigate and all sorts of other amphibious ships. So 10,000 sailors, by and large, we can actually fathom that. However, they seem to just be having fun on the waters, on the Gulf of Oman, on the Arabian Sea, further into the Indian Ocean. They are at a safe distance from the Strait of Hormuz, which means safely out of the missile range of the Iranians. We expect, for example, some much more gung-ho. This is the global superpower. This is essentially the number one country of the world that is not comparable anywhere near, so at least according to the Americans, to the number two. So why are they what the Yorubas call Tadimeyi? What the Yorubas call Majamasa? Again, I will translate. Tadimeyi means I want to fight you. But instead of approaching you to actually take the fight to you, I seem to actually be rolling backwards, be moving backwards away from you. Is this cowardice here? Majamasa is what we call, you go further a bit, do the active fighting, move further towards your enemy a bit. But in the very next scene, we are seeing you move backwards. That is the classic what is happening here. Even an ordinary boat, even an ordinary naval mine, not to talk of a VLCC or a proper oil tanker, has not been fired at with a bullet. Not to talk of a missile, not to talk of a drone, not to talk of a fighter jet. That is one. Number two is that up till now, America has not boarded any ship anywhere near that area. Not to talk of seizing the oil on it, not to talk of seizing the sailors on it. Number three is that actually the blockade is not blockading. I will explain. Just before I came to the studio now, tankertrackers.com, one of the most, essentially a neutral entity. Its job essentially is to, monitor sea, ocean traffic all over the world. It is what you will call the naval equivalent, the sea equivalent of flightradar.com, which monitors aerial, essentially aerial assets, fighter jets, commercial planes, everything that flies in the air. Tankertrackers.com has announced that between the time the Americans announced the blockade and this time, Iran has successfully exported nothing less than 9 million barrels of oil. And in fact, within the past 2-3 days, Iran has exported no less than 2 million barrels of oil in the middle of a blockade. Not just a blockade, an American blockade. According to some other sources, there is now a long list of Iranian ships, that have passed through, not just went in, also returned to the Persian Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz, passing through the so-called American blockade. So essentially, the answer to the question is, I don't know what CENTCOM is doing on the waters of the Sea of Oman and of the the Arabian seas. But this blockade, final answer, is not a mere blockading. Maybe it will start blockading much later. I don't know. Currently, as we speak, I don't see a blockade. I see a leaking sieve. Iranian and Iranian link ships passing front, right, and center. Thank you very much. That is your report for this today on this matter. See you in the next video. Thank you.